For 4 centuries the West has known him by a single word, and the word is a mistake. Even Grozny. English tongues turned it into the terrible, and the translation hardened into a verdict, a byword for cruelty, for madness, for a monster crowned. But in the Russian of his own century the word meant nothing so simple. Grozny came from groza, a thunderstorm. It meant fearsome, formidable, dread-inspiring, awe and menace fused into one, the quality of a power that cannot be safely defied. The men who first set that word beside his name did not mean that he was wicked. They meant that he was to be feared. Somewhere in the long passage from one language into another, and across 400 years, the awe drained away, and only the horror was left behind. From that single slippage grew the legend the world still carries, the wild-eyed tyrant, the iron staff, the body of a murdered son. And the legend is a caricature, but it is a caricature that fails in both directions. For this was also the boy crowned first Tsar of All Russia at 16, the ruler who took Kazan and Astrakhan and drove his frontier toward the rising sun, the sovereign who threw open a sea road to distant England and traded letters with its queen, the lawgiver who gave his people their first printed code, and he was, in the same lifetime, the architect of one of history's earliest true machines of terror. When his grave was opened, 4 centuries on, his bones carried a strange trace of mercury, as did the graves of his mother, his wife, his son. Poison or medicine, or nothing at all. The dead have never agreed. This is the story of the man beneath the mistranslated name. He was born, the chronicles agree, on the 25th of August in the year 1530, in the palace of the Grand Princes of Moscow, and named Ivan after his grandfather. A legend fastened itself to the hour of his birth, as legends will, that a great storm broke over the city as he came into the world, that thunder rolled across the Kremlin and lightning tore the summer sky. It is only a legend. No reliable witness set it down at the time, and it has the too neat shape of a tale told backward once men already knew what the child would become. Yet it is worth pausing over, because of the word. The Russian for a thunderstorm is groza, and the name the world would one day bind to this infant, Grozny, was cut from the same cloth. Not terrible, as we now hear the word, not wicked or vile, but storm-like, formidable, a thing that makes men afraid. The legend was false. The instinct behind it was not. His father was Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow, a hard and patient ruler who had waited most of a lifetime for a son and set aside a barren first wife to get one. In Elena Glinskaya, a young woman of a Lithuanian émigré family, he found both an heir and before long a second boy, Yuri, who was born deaf and would never be able to rule. Ivan was 3 years old when Vasily died in the closing weeks of 1533 of an infection that spread from a small sore on his leg until nothing his physicians tried could hold it back. He had ruled for 28 years. He left his throne to a toddler. Power passed then, astonishingly for that place and that age, to a woman. Elena Glinskaya ruled as regent for her infant son, and she ruled with more competence than her enemies cared to admit. She reformed the currency, drawing the Grand Principality's tangled coinage toward a single standard. The small silver coin that would come to be called the kopek belongs to her regency. She fortified towns, negotiated with hostile neighbors, and struck without hesitation at rivals within her own family, aided closely by Prince Ivan Telepnev-Obolensky, a man whom court gossip named her lover. For 5 years a woman held Muscovy together. Then, in the spring of 1538, she died. She was perhaps 27. The suddenness of it set tongues moving at once. The imperial envoy, Sigismund von Herberstein, who knew the Moscow court well, recorded the suspicion that she had been poisoned by the boyars who resented her rule. For centuries that was all it was, a suspicion, unprovable, hardening into rumour. Then, in our own age, when her remains were examined, the tests found mercury in startling quantity, and arsenic besides. It is tempting to read that as proof. It is not. Mercury sat in the medicines of the age, and in the cosmetics on every noblewoman's table. The dead of that century are simply full of it. The most that can honestly be said is that Elena Glinskaya may have been murdered, and that the ground has kept the question open. It is the first time in this story that a grave answers with mercury, and then refuses to say anything more. It will not be the last. Ivan was 8 years old and now an orphan, and now, in the way that mattered least and hurt most, and the most important, powerless person in Russia. With Elena gone, the great boyar families closed in like water over a stone. The Schwiskys and the Belskys seized the machinery of the state and wrenched it back and forth between them, one clan ascendant until another struck it down, the palace changing masters by intrigue and by force. Telepnev was arrested and died in prison. Men were seized at the very foot of the throne, and in the middle of it sat a small boy in whose name every faction claimed to act, and to whom none of them truly answered. What the child saw in those years we can reconstruct only in outline, and mostly through his own later telling, which survives, if it survives at all, in letters whose authenticity scholars still dispute. In them, the grown Tsar remembered a boyhood of neglect and studied insult. He and his deaf brother Yuri, he claimed, went hungry and unregarded while the boyars feasted, and men who bowed low to him in the throne room lounged with their boots on his dead father's furniture the moment they thought no royal eye was on them. We cannot know how much of that is true and how much is the practiced grievance of a ruler assembling his own defense. We should not pretend to see inside him. But the shape of the world he grew in is not in doubt a court where power changed hands by violence, where a child wore all the trappings of a sovereign and held none of the substance, and where the men standing nearest the throne were precisely the men most to be feared. Here a caution is owed because the temptation of this story is to draw a straight line from the frightened boy to the fearsome Tsar, and the line is not straight. A brutal childhood does not manufacture a brutal ruler on any reliable schedule. Countless children have survived far worse and gone on to gentleness. To say simply that the boy became the man is to skip over the whole of a life and every choice in it. And yet the seed was real, and those who watched him grow believed they had seen it planted. He had learned, before he was old enough to reason about it, that a throne was a thing men killed for. The first sign of what that seed might grow into came when Ivan was 13. In 1543, by the account of the chronicles, he turned on the Schwiskys at last. He ordered the seizure of Prince Andrei Schwisky, the most overbearing of them, and had him handed to the kennelman, thrown, the record says, to the dogs. Whether it happened in exactly that fashion we cannot be sure. The chroniclers wrote with hindsight and a taste for the emblematic image. But something turned in that year. The boy who had been passed like a token from faction to faction had discovered that he, too, could give an order that ended a man's life. He was 13, and he had absorbed the central lesson of the court that raised him. Almost everything we know of that court from the outside we owe to strangers. The fullest early window onto Muscovy was opened not by a Russian but by Herberstein, the Habsburg diplomat who had travelled twice to Moscow and who published, in 1549, a book of notes on the Russians that Europe read as revelation and gospel at once. It set a pattern that would hold for the rest of Ivan's life and for centuries after his death, that the most vivid, the most quoted, and the most damning accounts of this Tsar and his realm would come from foreigners, envoys and merchants, mercenaries and enemies, each of them seeing Russia through the narrow window of his own errand and his own fear. We will meet many of them before this story is done. It is worth remembering from the very beginning whose eyes we are being asked to look through. By the middle of the 1540s, the boy was becoming a young man, and the young man had grown impatient with a regency that had never truly governed in his name. Around him, the churchmen and the few surviving councillors began to speak of something without precedent in Russian history. Not merely a coming of age, but a crowning. Not merely another Grand Prince of Moscow, but a title lifted whole from the vanished Caesars of Rome. On the 16th of January in the year 1547, the doors of the Cathedral of the Dormition would open, and a boy of 16 would walk toward a crown no Russian had ever worn. He would take a title borrowed from the Caesars, and with it a word would fasten itself to his name that 4 centuries could not pry loose. The reforms would come first. The terror would come long after. But it began here, in a cold palace full of knives, with a child who had learned before he could reason that a throne was a thing men killed for. The coronation of a boy king was not merely a transition of power, it was a transmutation of the state. On the 16th of January 1547, the Kremlin was transformed into a theatre of divine right. Metropolitan Macarius, the preeminent churchman of the realm, presided over a ceremony that reached back through the centuries to claim a lineage that had long since vanished from the map. As the young Ivan walked into the Cathedral of the Dormition, he was not simply the heir of his father or grandfather. He was ascending to a status that had never before existed in the Russian lands. He was to be the first to be anointed as Tsar, a title that carried the heavy echoes of the Roman Caesars and the lost majesty of Byzantium. The crown placed upon his head, the storied cap of monomach, was a relic of legend, said to have been a gift from a Byzantine emperor to a Kievan prince. Whether the history of the cap was fact or pious invention mattered far less than the weight it conferred. By taking this title, Ivan was declaring that Muscovy was no longer a mere principality among many, but the rightful spiritual heir to the broken empire of the East. The theology articulated by Macarius was clear. The Tsar stood in a unique, unmediated relationship with God, a sovereign set apart to lead the Russian people toward their destiny. To the boy standing in the incense-thick air, the ceremony offered at least the form of an escape from the suffocating grip of the boyar families who had fought over him for a decade. He was 16, he was anointed, and he was the autocrat of all the Russias. The coronation was but the first of the spring's transformations. 2 weeks later, in early February, the new Tsar turned his attention to the matter of a consort. The choice of a bride was managed through a traditional bride show, a process where noblewomen from across the realm were gathered so that the sovereign might find his match. From among the candidates, Ivan chose Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina Yurieva. She was of a family that, while prominent, was not among the most fiercely ambitious of the high-ranking houses, a choice that perhaps reflected the Tsar's desire to build a life beyond the reach of the factions that had haunted his youth. By bringing Anastasia into the Kremlin, he established a center of domestic gravity. She would become the first Russian Tsaritsa, and her family, the Romanovs, would one day hold a place in history that neither she nor her husband could have possibly imagined. For a moment the atmosphere of the court softened, and there was a sense that the reign of the Tsar might be defined by domestic stability rather than the cycles of blood that had defined his minority. But the city of Moscow was a fragile thing, a sprawling, wooden metropolis that was perpetually one spark away from disaster. In the heat of June 1547, that disaster arrived. A fire began in the city, and in the dry, high summer air, it did not merely burn, it consumed. The flames raced through the densely packed wooden houses, leaping from street to street with a speed that defied any attempt to contain them. The Kremlin itself was threatened, its own wooden structures catching, and the bells of the great cathedrals rang out in a desperate, frantic alarm that could be heard for miles. By the time the fire died down, the city was a ruin. Thousands had perished in the inferno, and tens of thousands were left without shelter, their homes and their livelihoods reduced to ash and charcoal. The catastrophe did not merely destroy the city's structure, it shattered the fragile order of the new reign. In the desperate, smoke-choked aftermath, the populace sought someone to blame for the scale of the devastation. The finger of suspicion turned toward the Glinskys, the family of the Tsar's mother, who had maintained significant influence at court since the death of Elena Glinskaya. Rumors began to circulate, fueled by terror and grief, that the Glinskys had used sorcery to bring about the fire, dipping human hearts into water and sprinkling the city to ignite the flames. It was a classic manifestation of the medieval mind in crisis. When the world falls apart, there must be a witch to burn. The anger of the mob was not directed at the Tsar himself, but at the men who surrounded him. A violent uprising erupted, and the city turned into a hunting ground. A kinsman of the Glinsky family was cornered and killed by the rioters within the very walls of the Kremlin, the blood staining the sacred ground of the state. For the young Tsar, this was a brutal, visceral education in the limits of his own authority. He had been crowned as an autocrat, a ruler, ordained by heaven, yet here was his people, tearing his kin apart in the shadow of his own palace. He was forced to confront the reality that his power was not a shield, it was a target. In the accounts left to us, we see the Tsar's reaction framed through the lens of a ruler who had been pushed to the edge of his endurance. He did not retreat into the shadows, he stood his ground. He faced the rioters not with the cold calculation of the later years, but with the raw, volatile energy of a boy who had seen his foundations crumble. The event left a mark on him. It was a reminder that the Grozny, the thunderstorm, was not merely a quality he possessed, but a force that could be turned against him. He was supposed to be the awe that quieted the mob, the figure whose very presence restored order, yet he had seen how quickly that order could dissolve into chaos. These months, from the winter coronation to the summer fire, formed the crucible of his early rule. He had claimed the title of Caesar, he had taken a wife, and he had seen his city burn. He had been forced to witness the terrifying volatility of the people he was anointed to lead. The Glinsky riots were not merely a disturbance, they were a foundational trauma for the young Tsar, a moment when the abstract power of the coronation met the hard, unyielding reality of a desperate populace. He had learned that he could be the master of the state, but he could not control the elements, and he could not easily command the hearts of those who feared they had been abandoned by God. Yet, rather than succumb to the paranoia that would define his later years, the immediate aftermath of the fire saw a different path taken. The young Tsar began to look for ways to stabilize his realm, turning to a circle of advisors who sought to steer him toward structural reform. He was reaching for a way to govern that did not rely on the mercurial whims of the mob or the treacherous feuding of the boyars. He was beginning to understand that the title of Tsar required more than a crown. It required a system. Within 6 months of taking a crown no Russian had ever worn, The boy, who would be called the fearsome, had watched his own capital burn to the ground and its people turn on his blood in the streets. He was 16, anointed and afraid, and out of the ashes, for a little while, would come not vengeance, but something almost no one expects of him now: law, reform, and the best years of his reign. The fire that consumed Moscow in the summer of 1547 did more than strip the city of its wooden heart. It stripped the young Tsar of his illusions. He had been crowned and anointed, the first of his line, to claim the title of Tsar, yet he had found his throne sitting in the middle of a city turned to ash, with a mob baying for the heads of his own kin. The Glinsky family, his mother's blood, had been blamed for the disaster, accused of practicing sorcery to set the city ablaze, and they had been torn apart in the streets, as Ivan watched from the safety of the countryside. It was a brutal lesson in the fragility of power. He was the sovereign, but he was not yet the master of his own house. In the aftermath of the flames, the young ruler reached for something he had lacked his entire life: reliable counsel. He found it in an informal circle of men who would eventually be known to history as the Chosen Council. The name itself is a later invention, surfacing in the bitter correspondence of Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a man who would eventually flee the Tsar and write to justify his betrayal. We should be cautious with the term. The council was never a formal cabinet or a constitutional body. It was a shifting, intimate group of advisors who, for a time, channeled the Tsar's energy away from the feuding boyar clans and toward the project of the state. At the center of this orbit stood Alexei Adashev, a man of modest background who possessed an administrative mind that was, by all accounts, both sharp and tireless. Beside him was the priest Sylvester, a man of intense religious conviction who exerted a powerful, often moralizing influence over the Tsar's private conscience. And there was Metropolitan Macarius, the head of the Russian Church, who acted as a mentor, a father figure, and the primary architect of the ideology that would frame Ivan's reign as a sacred duty. These men did not simply manage the court, they began to disassemble the chaotic, predatory system of government that had defined Ivan's minority. In 1549, the Tsar took the unprecedented step of convening the first Zemsky Sobor, or Assembly of the Land. It was not a parliament in any modern sense, but it was a gathering that reached beyond the narrow, suffocating circle of the high-ranking boyars. It brought together representatives from across the realm to deliberate on the future of the state. It was a signal that the Tsar intended to govern in consultation with his people, or at least with the influential layers of his society, rather than merely presiding over the private wars of the aristocracy. It was a move toward stability that looked, for a few years, like the dawn of a new, more orderly Russia. The primary achievement of this period was the Sudebnik of 1550, a comprehensive new law code that stood as the bedrock of the Tsar's reform program. It was a document of immense ambition, seeking to bring a vast and disparate land under a single written standard of justice. It curbed the excesses of the local governors, those men who had long treated their districts as private hunting grounds for bribes and extortion. It protected the rights of the peasantry in their interactions with the state, and it sought to curb the corruption that had become the lifeblood of the old boyar system. For the first time, there was a sense that the law was not merely a whim of the powerful, but a structure that could hold the state together. Parallel to the law came the reform of the sword. The military of the time was a disjointed force, reliant on feudal levies and the erratic availability of noble cavalry. Ivan and his advisers recognized that a modern state required a modern army, and so they established the streltsy, the first permanent standing infantry in Russian history. These were professional soldiers trained in the use of firearms, loyal directly to the state, rather than to individual boyar lords. It was a quiet revolution in the way power was projected, shifting the balance of force from the horse-bound nobility to the organized musketry-wielding infantry of the Tsar. The church, too, underwent a massive transformation. In 1551, the Tsar summoned the Stoglav Council, or the Council of the 100 Chapters, to standardize the practice of the faith across the land. The goal was to purge the church of local idiosyncrasies and corruption, ensuring that every soul in the realm was praying in the same manner to the same God. It was an effort to unify the spiritual life of Russia, mirroring the administrative unity being forged in the secular courts. Through these years, the Tsar was not the brooding, solitary figure of legend. He was a busy, restless, and remarkably effective executive. At the heart of this transformation was the Tsarina, Anastasia Romanovna Zakariina Yurieva, had been chosen in a mass bride show, a traditional display where the most beautiful and noble girls of the realm were paraded before the young ruler. He had chosen her, and by all contemporary accounts, the marriage was a profound success. She was seen as a calming, steadying influence, a woman who tempered the Tsar's volatile moods and provided a focal point for his personal life. Even the Tsar's enemies in later years would acknowledge that when Anastasia was alive, the Tsar was a different man. The good years of his reign, as they would later be called, coincide almost perfectly with the duration of their marriage. When we see the later violence, it is impossible to ignore the silence that descended upon his life when she was gone. Yet, even as he built these new foundations, the shadow of his childhood remained. The boy who had watched the Schwiskis and the Belskis fight over his cradle was still the man who sat on the throne. He was a reformer, yes, but he was a reformer who lived among the very men who had terrorized his youth. He treated them with a veneer of cooperation, but the suspicion was always there, a cold, hard knot in the center of his personality. He was creating a state that could function without the boyars, a state that answered only to the Tsar, and that shift in power was not lost on the old families. They watched the rise of Adashev and the strengthening of the Streltsy with mounting alarm. The foreign accounts of this period, written by merchants and adventurers like Richard Chancellor, who would soon arrive on the northern coast, paint a picture of a flourishing court. They saw a young Tsar who was educated, curious, and deeply engaged with the world, a ruler who was building a bridge between the isolated heart of Muscovy and the rising powers of the West. But we must remember the source of this light. Much of what we praise as the golden age of Ivan's rule was codified and burnished by later chroniclers, men who were looking back from the depths of the terror that would come. They needed the early years to look like a lost paradise, a time when the Tsar was wise and the state was just, to contrast with the darkness that followed. The truth is likely more complex. The reforms were real, and they were necessary, but they were also a power grab. By centralizing the law, by professionalizing the army, and by aligning the church with the state, Ivan was systematically stripping the boyar class of their traditional autonomy. He was not just a reformer, he was a revolutionary, and his revolution was aimed at the very men who stood at his right hand. He was building a machine of state that would, in time, require a different kind of master. For a handful of years, Russia had something it had not had in a generation, a Tsar who built rather than burned. He gave his people a law code, a standing army, an assembly to be heard in, and a wife the whole court believed had gentled him. It could not last. Beyond the eastern forests on the Volga stood the old enemy that had raided and enslaved Russian towns for lifetimes, and the young Tsar had decided that Kazan would fall. The young Tsar had inherited a state that was little more than a fortress in waiting. For generations the shadow of the Golden Horde had stretched across the Russian plains, and though the great empire of the Mongols had fractured into smaller khanates, the threat remained constant. Kazan, the capital of the most powerful of these successors, held the Volga like a dagger at the throat of Muscovy. From its high, fortified walls, the Tatars launched raids that drained the Russian countryside of labor and wealth, plundering towns and carrying off captives in a cycle of violence that felt as inevitable as the changing seasons. To strike at Kazan was not merely a military campaign, it was a crusade for legitimacy, a test of whether the new Tsar could unify his fractured realm and secure the horizons of the Russian world. He had failed twice before. The campaigns of 1547 and 1549 had bogged down in the mud and the mismanagement of a court that still squabbled over precedents, even in the field. But by 1552, the machinery of the state had begun to hum with a new, focused intensity. Ivan brought to the siege of Kazan the methodical, grinding patience of a sovereign who had learned that victory was a matter of logistics as much as courage. He mobilized a massive host, bringing in heavy siege artillery and engineers trained in the latest arts of European mining. When the Russian army arrived at the city in the late summer of 1552, it did not merely surround the walls, it began to systematically erase them. The siege was a testament to the Tsar's ability to command the focus of his nobles and the engineering talent of his realm. Sappers dug deep beneath the foundations of the mighty stone fortifications, packing the tunnels with enough powder to shake the earth. On the 2nd of October, the mines were detonated. The shock waves ripped through the defences and the Russian forces poured into the breaches. The sack that followed was, by the accounts of the chronicles, a scene of total devastation, with the defenders overwhelmed and the city's resistance shattered in a single day of ruin. We must be cautious with the numbers. The medieval chroniclers possessed a penchant for inflating the toll of the fallen to underscore the magnitude of the triumph, but the result was indisputable. The gateway to the east had been torn open. With Kazan fallen, the entire length of the Volga was exposed to Moscow's reach. By 1556, after a preliminary submission and subsequent consolidation, the Khanate of Astrakhan was also annexed, securing the river's mouth and the trade routes to the Caspian. In less than a decade, the Tsar had transformed a medieval principality into a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. This was the Grozny that his contemporaries recognized, not a caricature of malice, but a ruler whose power was indeed like a storm, irresistible and vast. He had reached further than his ancestors ever dared, and he had done so by binding his nobles to a singular national goal. To commemorate the victory over the Eastern Khanate, Ivan ordered the construction of a monument that would define the skyline of Moscow. Rising on the edge of Red Square, the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Virgin on the moat, the building the world would eventually come to know as St. Basil's, was a riot of colour and architectural ambition. Its 8 distinct chapels, each topped with a swirling, bulbous cupola, were designed to reflect the heavens and the earthly triumph of the Tsar. It was a structure without a direct precursor in Russian masonry, a stone flame that seemed to defy the heavy, austere logic of the Kremlin walls. Here, in the creation of this masterpiece, the legend of Ivan's cruelty found one of its most persistent anchors. For centuries, the story was told that the Tsar was so overwhelmed by the beauty of the cathedral that he ordered the architects, Barmer and Postnik, to be blinded, ensuring that they could never again build anything that might rival the splendor of the church on Red Square. It is a story that has been painted on canvases and repeated in countless histories, a perfect, chilling emblem of the tyrant who crushes the beauty he calls into being. It is also, quite demonstrably, a myth. The documentary record is clear, even if the legend is louder. The architect, known as Postnik Yakovlev, continued his career, long after the scaffolding was taken down. He remained a respected master of his craft, working on the fortifications of the Kazan Kremlin and later contributing to the construction of other ecclesiastical projects. Decades after the cathedral was consecrated, long after Ivan's own reign had descended into the shadows of the oprichnina, Postnik was still active, even adding a chapel to the very cathedral he had designed. The legend of the blinded architect is a narrative construction, a piece of folklore that tells us more about how later generations viewed the Tsar than it does about the reality of his court. It is a cautionary tale for the historian. The stone remains and the records remain, but the myth often proves more durable than the truth. The Tsar was at the zenith of his prestige. He had conquered the old enemies, he had expanded the borders, and he had given his capital a landmark that spoke of a new imperial Russia. The court at Moscow was no longer a backwater, and the name of the young Tsar was beginning to circulate in the courts of Europe, carried by the reports of merchants and the few envoys who had braved the long journey to his capital. He had proven his strength to his boyars and his devotion to the church, and he seemed poised to lead Russia into a new era of stability and expansion. But the world beyond the Russian forests was shifting in ways the Tsar could not yet measure. The power he wielded was formidable, and the awe he inspired was real. But the reach of his influence was still bounded by the geography of a landlocked domain. He was a master of the Volga, but the world's commerce was moving by sea. And in the hidden reaches of the north, in the grey, churning waters of the White Sea, the currents of history were beginning to change. On Red Square the impossible cathedral rose, stone flame upon stone flame, a monument to a Tsar at the height of his power and his fame. The men who built it were not blinded, whatever the legend would later insist. And far to the north, on a freezing white sea, no Russian ruler had thought to watch. A storm was driving a lost English ship toward a shore that would change everything, and open a door between Moscow and a queen not yet crowned in London. The ship that appeared out of the Arctic fog in the late summer of 1553 was not looking for Russia. It was looking for Cathay. The Edward Bonaventure, under the command of Richard Chancellor, was the last survivor of a three-ship English expedition sent by the Company of Merchant Adventurers to find a northeast passage to the riches of the East. The other two vessels had vanished into the teeth of an Arctic gale, their crews lost to the ice. Chancellor, drifting into the White Sea and finding the mouth of the northern Dvina, believed he had arrived at the edge of the world. He expected to find savages. Instead, he found fishermen, and then, as word of the strange high-sided vessel spread, he found the reach of the Tsar. The arrival of the English was, in the language of the time, an act of providence. For decades, Russia had been a landlocked giant, its western trade routes strangled by the jealous gatekeeping of the Baltic powers, the Swedes, the Poles, the Livonians, who feared the growth of Muscovite power and systematically blocked the import of Western arms and technology. Suddenly here was an English captain with a ship, an open sea, and a sovereign in Moscow who was desperate for both. Chancellor was invited to the capital, and though the journey overland was a grueling slog of hundreds of miles through forests and snow, he emerged into the heart of the Kremlin in the winter of 1554. What Chancellor saw and reported back to London became the template for the Western view of Russia for generations. He wrote of the Tsar's court as a place of immense, heavy opulence, of gold-laden robes, of silent, bowing boyars, and of a ruler who commanded a reverence so absolute it bordered on the divine. Chancellor was a man of business, writing to impress his investors, and his account was designed to justify the immense risk of the northern route. Yet he was also a man of genuine astonishment. He described a Tsar who was physically imposing, deeply intelligent, and possessed of a curiosity that kept the visitor in the palace for hours, peppered with questions about the geography, the governance, and the customs of the distant island kingdom. In 1555, the Muscovy Company was chartered in London, becoming one of the first great joint stock corporations in history. It held a monopoly on the Russian trade, and in return, it provided the Tsar with what he wanted most: cloth, tin, lead, and, crucially, the technology of modern warfare. Even granted the English extraordinary privileges, allowing them to establish trading houses in Moscow and Vologda, exempting them from tolls and treating them as an extension of his own diplomatic reach. He saw the English not merely as traders, but as a potential ally against the hostile ring of neighbours that pressed against his borders. When Elizabeth I ascended the English throne in 1558, the relationship shifted from a mere commercial arrangement into a personal, often turbulent correspondence. Ivan took to the Queen with a fervour that the English court often found difficult to calibrate. He viewed her as a peer, a fellow sovereign, and in the decades that followed, the letters that flowed between Moscow and London grew thick with grand declarations of friendship and occasionally with sharp imperial frustration when the Queen's policies failed to meet his expectations. It was during these years that the Tsar's fascination with the English tie began to take on a more desperate character. As the internal politics of his reign soured, Ivan looked toward the Northern Sea not just as a trade route, but as a potential sanctuary. The diplomatic record filtered through the reports of later envoys like Anthony Jenkinson and Jerome Horsey suggests that the Tsar began to contemplate scenarios that would have been unthinkable for his predecessors. In his later years, he would probe the possibility of a marriage to an English noblewoman, specifically Mary Hastings, a kinswoman of the Queen. He even, by the accounts of those who served in his court, began to sound out the English on the prospect of asylum should his position in Moscow ever become untenable. These were the reports of men who had every reason to make the Tsar seem eccentric to their superiors in London. Horsey, in particular, was a man who thrived on proximity to the dangerous, who wrote of court intrigues with a breathless, self-serving flair that modern historians must handle with extreme caution. We cannot know if Ivan ever truly believed he would find a refuge in the English court, or if these overtures were merely a high-stakes diplomatic feint designed to keep Elizabeth invested in his survival. But the consistency of the English presence in his life, the merchants, the ambassadors, the doctors, and the shipwrights who moved through the Kremlin gates, is undeniable. They were the Tsar's window to the West, and he was their gateway to the vast, untapped wealth of the East. The foreign pen held by these men etched a portrait of the Tsar that was at once sophisticated and barbaric, a man of profound political vision who was simultaneously prone to fits of sudden, volatile rage. They were the ones who noted the changing atmosphere of the court, the way the silence in the throne room grew heavier, and the way the Tsar's eye would drift toward his inner circle, as if searching for a betrayal that had not yet occurred. They were the witnesses to a power that was expanding, building, and reaching across the world, even as it began to consume itself from within. The trade route matured, and the ships arrived with increasing regularity, bringing the goods of Europe to the doorstep of the Tsar. It was a partnership of convenience that served both empires, a connection that defied geography and transformed the strategic map of the 16th century. The English were the only Westerners who saw the Tsar not as a distant, legendary figure from the dark corners of the map, but as a man who sat at a desk and signed contracts, who argued over the price of wax and the delivery of iron, and who, in his own way, felt a strange, grasping affection for the kingdom across the sea. So the Tsar of All Russia and the merchants of a distant island became, improbably, partners. a door thrown open in the frozen north that would carry English guns east and Russian furs west for 100 years. In his own court, Ivan called the English tie precious and would cling to it more strangely as the years darkened. But the years were about to darken. For inside the palace, the one steadying presence anyone had ever seen soften the Tsar was quietly and then quickly failing. The partnership with the distant islanders was a triumph of statecraft, a gamble that paid in iron and cloth, but the state was never merely the sum of its treaties. Inside the Kremlin, the life of the Tsar was anchored to something far more fragile than a trade agreement. For 13 years, Anastasia Romanovna had been the quiet center of a turbulent world. She was of the minor nobility, a choice that had been his own, and, to the observers of the court, she was the one string that held the instrument in tune. She had survived the fires of 1547, the birth of children, and the endless, stifling pressure of the boyar clans. Then, in the summer of 1560, that anchor gave way. Anastasia had been unwell for some time, plagued by a slow, wasting illness that defied the prayers and the poultices of the royal physicians. When she died on the 7th of August, she was perhaps 30 years old. The impact on the Tsar was immediate and, by every account that reached the chronicles, catastrophic. It was not merely the loss of a wife, it was the dissolution of a protective barrier he had spent his young adulthood constructing. In the weeks that followed, the grief that seized him did not simply run its course, it began to transmute into something sharper, more volatile, and intensely focused. The whispers began almost before the funeral rites had concluded. The air in the Kremlin grew heavy with the talk of poison. It was not a new suspicion in a world where food and drink were routinely tasted for safety, yet this time it felt different to those who lived in the shadow of the throne. Even himself, in his later writings and his outbursts against his own nobility, would fix upon the idea that Anastasia had been murdered by his enemies, systematically thinned away by the very men he had once relied upon to help him govern. He saw a conspiracy, and in the months after her death, he began to act as if that conspiracy were the only truth in his world. 4 centuries later, a different kind of witness would be summoned to testify. When the grave of the Tsarina was opened in the year 2000, researchers found her remains remarkably well preserved. They took samples, fragments of hair, shards of fabric, remnants of the body, and subjected them to the cold, precise scrutiny of modern forensic chemistry. The results were startling. The levels of mercury found in her hair were massive, far beyond what any human body should contain. Arsenic was present in significant quantities as well. For a moment it seemed that the ancient, persistent rumors had been vindicated by the hard science of the 21st century. But history is rarely so cooperative. Mercury, in the 16th century, was not merely a poison. It was a ubiquitous constituent of the medicines prescribed by the most learned physicians of the day. It was also the primary ingredient in the heavy white cosmetics used by the women of the high nobility to maintain the paleness that beauty demanded. A high concentration of mercury in a body from the middle of the 16th century is not a smoking gun. It is a recurring, frustrating, and ultimately ambiguous reality of the period. We cannot know if the mercury in her hair was the instrument of a political assassination or the side effect of the very medicine meant to save her life. The grave offers up the data, but it refuses to offer the motive. What is certain is not that she was poisoned, but that the Tsar believed she had been, and that this belief became a weapon in his hands. The loss of Anastasia shattered the delicate equilibrium of the chosen council, the circle of reformers and friends that had guided the early, optimistic years of his reign. The priest Sylvester and the administrator Alexei Adashev had been the twin pillars of his government, but in the wake of the Tsarina's death, the Tsar's regard for them vanished. he could no longer see them as mentors. He saw them as architects of a betrayal, of a heir. If the Tsarina had been murdered, then the men who had been closest to him were, in his mind, either complicit or dangerously negligent. The purge was swift and absolute. Sylvester was sent to a monastery, effectively exiled from the life of the court, while Adashev was stripped of his authority and eventually imprisoned, dying in the western marches before he could ever clear his name. They were the men who had urged restraint, who had moderated his impulses, and who had represented the hope of a reformed, orderly Muscovy. With their removal, the last of the voices that dared to offer the Tsar a gentle correction was silenced. The death of the pious Metropolitan Macarius in 1563, the final elder statesman who had been a father figure to Ivan since his coronation, completed the isolation. The circle was broken. The restraints were gone. The Tsar had grown up watching the boyars treat the throne as their personal property, and he had learned to survive by masking his intent and waiting for the moment to strike. Now those lessons were being applied to the governance of an entire realm. He was no longer the boy who watched from the corners of a room. He was the man who defined the boundaries of the room itself. He had been surrounded by men who claimed to serve him while they vied for the power to manipulate him, and he had come to the conclusion that he could trust no one who had been part of the world of his youth. This was not a sudden descent into madness, as later caricature would suggest. It was a cold, deliberate withdrawal of trust. The man who had once sought to build a state through consensus and law now began to suspect that consensus was merely a mask for treason. He saw his enemies everywhere, and because he held the absolute power of the autocrat, he began to treat his suspicions as if they were established facts. He withdrew from the public gaze, moving toward the shadows, leaving behind the open reformist rhetoric of his early years. He was 30 years old, a man who had already known a lifetime of loss. His father had died when he was a child, his mother had been taken from him before he reached his teens, and now his wife, the woman he had chosen, the woman who had been his companion through the most formative and grueling years of his life, was gone. Every person who had provided him with a sense of stability or an alternative path had been removed by death or disgrace. He was reaching for the levers of power with a hand that had grown accustomed to the sensation of being betrayed. The woman the court thought had gentled him was gone, and centuries later the strands of her hair would still carry their strange freight of mercury, poison, or medicine, or the ordinary chemistry of a violent age. The grave has never said. Whatever the truth, the Tsar believed she had been murdered, and grief in a sovereign is never only grief. It was hardening into suspicion, and suspicion was looking for a name. In a losing war on the western frontier, it would soon find one, a prince, a friend, and a traitor. It was becoming clear to the Tsar that the world outside the borders of Muscovy was a web of constraints, and the most immediate of those was the Baltic Sea. For generations, the Russian state had been a landlocked giant, its trade with the West choked by the gatekeepers of the North, the Livonian Order, a remnant of a crusading era that now acted as a toll collector for the commerce of the world. In 1558, Ivan moved to break that hold. The Livonian War began as a calculated push for a coastline, a search for the ports that would allow Russia to trade on equal terms with England and the Holy Roman Empire. The early campaigns were swift and overwhelming. Russian forces swept through the crumbling fortifications of the Order, and it seemed that the Baltic would be Ivan's before the year was out. But the war did not end, because the war was never merely about the Livonian coast. As the Russian advance turned into a permanent occupation, it drew in the great powers of the north. Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, each sensing a threat to its own commerce and stability, formed a volatile, shifting coalition to halt the Russian tide. What had begun as a swift annexation curdled into a 25-year slog, a grinding conflict of attrition that drained the treasury and demanded ever stricter control over the resources of the realm. The army, once a force of pride, found itself stretched across a frontier that refused to be secured. With the mounting costs came the familiar, corrosive suspicion that failures on the field were not the result of foreign strength, but of domestic sabotage. This was the landscape into which the defection of Prince Andrei Kurbsky fell like a stone in a shallow well. Kurbsky was not merely a soldier, he was a scion of the Rurikid line, a veteran commander who had fought alongside the Tsar at the siege of Kazan, and a member of the inner circle that had once helped guide the young monarch. In the spring of 1564, he fled across the border into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was more than a retreat, it was a manifesto of betrayal. To Ivan, it was the final confirmation that the boyars, the very men who had surrounded his childhood, were inherently incapable of loyalty. There followed, by tradition, a remarkable exchange of letters. The correspondence between the Tsar and the turncoat prince became one of the most enduring documents of the age, a window into the mind of a ruler and the rage of a defector. They debated the nature of power, the limits of obedience, and the meaning of the Tsar's duty to his realm. Kurbsky, writing from the safety of the enemy camp, accused Ivan of shedding the blood of his best servants, of ruling by the terror of his whims, and of abandoning the Christian virtues of a shepherd to his people. He painted the Tsar as a man consumed by a dark, irrational rage, a tyrant who had traded the counsel of wise men for the whispers of sycophants. The Tsar's replies, if we accept them as his, were a cold, sweeping defense of the autocracy he had been born to uphold. He spoke of the God-given right of the sovereign to command, of the necessity of absolute obedience, and of the fundamental treason of those who sought to limit the Tsar's will. He positioned himself not as a man who chose cruelty, but as a man who, like the thunderstorm, the groza, was the inevitable manifestation of a divine corrective power. He claimed he was a shepherd who had been forced to wield the staff against wolves, even when those wolves wore the faces of his own boyars. Yet we must approach these documents with a profound and necessary caution. In 1971, the historian Edward L. Keenan published a study that shattered the long-held assumption that these were genuine contemporary transcripts of a royal exchange. Keenan argued that the letters were likely a literary fabrication of the 17th century, a project of later polemicists who sought to define the nature of Russian tyranny by projecting it backward into the mouth of the first Tsar. While most scholars, including the respected historian Ruslan Skrinnikov, have defended the correspondence as authentic, the debate remains unresolved. If the letters are truly his, they are the most intimate glimpse we have into the Tsar's own philosophy of rule. If they are an invention, they tell us something equally important, that for generations the legend of Ivan's terrible nature was so powerful that it demanded a written record to justify itself. We must treat their content not as a transcript but as a mirror, one that may reflect the Tsar's own mind, or perhaps only the way his enemies wished to remember him. The defection of Kurbsky served as a catalyst for a deeper, more paranoid turn in the court. The war in Livonia had stalled, the treasury was depleted, and the old order of the Boyar Council appeared, in the Tsar's eyes, to be a nest of conspirators. He looked at his own commanders and saw potential Kurbskys. He looked at his own ministers and saw shadows. He had begun the reign as a reformer, a gatherer of lands, and a builder of a new, centralized state. But the reality of rule, the weight of the war, and the stinging reality of the betrayal had curdled his ambition into a defensive, hollowed-out isolation. The Tsar had become a man who believed that the only way to save his state was to break it, to separate himself from the body of the realm, and from that distance begin to purge it of the perceived contagion of treason. The foreign pens were now moving in synchronicity. Kurbsky himself would go on to write a history of the reign, a work that served as a foundational text for the legend of the tyrant, ensuring that the European courts would view Ivan through the lens of a wronged, noble refugee. It was a narrative of a man who had descended into a madness that was as much a moral failing as it was a political one. But this view, while compelling, obscured the systematic, cold-blooded nature of what was to come. The Tsar was not drifting into a fever dream. He was preparing for a reorganization of power that would shock the sensibilities of his own people and the observers abroad. The border was no longer merely a place where the war was fought. It was a psychological boundary. The prince who had fought at the Tsar's side now wrote to him from across the border as an enemy, and if the letters that survive are truly theirs, each accused the other of destroying Russia. To Ivan, the lesson was simple and total. Treason had reached the men closest to the throne, and no oath could be trusted. And then, in the dead of winter, the Tsar did the one thing no one in Moscow could have predicted. He packed the treasury, gathered his family, and left his own capital, with no word of when or whether he would return. The departure was as sudden as a change in the weather, and it was meant to be seen as such. In the final days of December, in the year 1564, the Tsar packed his life into a line of sledges that stretched for miles across the frozen, rutted roads north of the capital. He took his wife, his sons, his treasury, and the most sacred icons of his house, but he left behind the government of Russia. He left behind the boyars, the bureaucrats, the councils, and the empty shell of the Kremlin. He rode until he reached the village of Alexandrova Sloboda, a forested retreat he had fortified until it functioned more like a fortress than a country house, and there he locked the gates. He did not send word to the city. He did not issue a decree. He simply went silent. For weeks, Moscow sat in a state of mounting, suffocating dread. The silence from the north was not merely an absence of command. It was a void where the law used to be. A state that did not know its own borders or its own future began to fray. Without the Tsar's seal, the courts stalled. Without his authority, the nobility looked at one another with suspicion, each man wondering if he was the one who had finally pushed the sovereign too far, or if he was the one who would be blamed for the collapse of the realm. It was a masterpiece of political theatre, a calculated performance of the very word that defined his rule. Ivan was being Grozny. He was being the thunderstorm, the unseen presence that gathers in the dark until the air grows heavy and the world holds its breath, waiting for the strike. In January, the silence broke. 2 letters were delivered to Moscow, written in the Tsar's own hand and read aloud to the assembled city. They were a dual-bladed instrument. The first was addressed to the church and the boyars, and it was a catalogue of grievances that stretched back to his childhood. It accused them of treason, of embezzlement, of cowardice in the face of the enemy, and of a general moral rot that he claimed had poisoned the state. The second letter was addressed to the common people, the merchants, and the townsfolk of Moscow. In this one, he swore that he held no grudge against them, that they were innocent of the corruption of the elites, and that he had only left the throne because he could no longer bear to watch the realm be dismantled by the greed of the powerful. It was an ultimatum, wrapped in a promise of protection. By dividing his subjects, he had effectively isolated his enemies. The abdication was a threat, not a resignation. It was a gamble that the fear of anarchy was stronger than the resentment of his rule. The gamble worked with a terrifying precision. The city did not cheer, it panicked. Deputations of clergy and boyars, their robes dusty from the road, and their faces drawn with genuine terror, rode to Alexandrova Sloboda to plead with the Tsar to return. They were not begging for his mercy, they were begging for the restoration of the only thing that kept the peace, however bloody that peace might be. They were begging for their own chains, provided those chains were held by a hand they knew. When the delegations arrived at the gates of the retreat, they found a man who had already moved beyond the reach of their politics. He did not merely agree to return, he dictated the terms of his own surrender, which were in reality the terms of a total conquest. He told them he would come back to the Kremlin, but only on the condition that he be granted the power to punish traitors as he saw fit, without the interference of the Church, without the checks of the Council, and without the traditional constraints of the law. He demanded the creation of a private domain, a territory carved out of his own kingdom that would answer to no one but his own will. He demanded an instrument of enforcement that would be his eyes, his ears, and his hand, separate from the rest of the realm. He was the boy who had watched 30 years prior, as the boyars feasted in the shadow of his father's funeral. He was the child who had learned that those who held the power were those who dared to act, while others only argued. He had internalized that lesson, refining it into a cold, clinical art of statecraft. In his isolation at Alexandrova Sloboda, he had not been brooding in madness. He had been constructing a mechanism. He had recognized that the old machinery of the state, the consensus of the aristocracy and the weight of tradition, was a cage, not a support. He needed a way to bypass the slow, grinding gears of the bureaucracy and strike directly at the foundations of the nobility. The scholars of the later centuries have debated the sincerity of his retreat. Some argue it was a genuine moment of crisis, a man pushed to the brink of a nervous collapse by the weight of his own paranoia. Others see it as a cold-blooded tactical maneuver, a masterstroke of psychological warfare designed to consolidate absolute power. We cannot know which is true, for the man left behind no record of his own heart, only the record of his actions. But whether it was a moment of weakness or a moment of profound, terrifying clarity, the result was the same. The Tsar had made the state dependent on him in a way that had never existed before. He had forced the nobility to choose between his direct rule and the abyss of a power vacuum, and he had made certain they would choose him. He had gambled his own crown and won it back doubled. A capital that had watched its sovereign walk away now begged him to rule without limits. And he accepted, on the condition that no one could ever tell him no again. He would return to Moscow. But he would return with a new kind of power, and it had a name the Russian language would soon learn to speak only in a whisper, the oprichnina. The division was announced in the first days of 1565. Ivan arrived at the village of Alexandrova Sloboda, north of Moscow, and from there sent word that he was abdicating his throne. He had been betrayed, he claimed, by the boyars who had mismanaged the realm and plotted against his life. He would not return to the capital, and he would not rule a people who refused to purge their own traitors. The city of Moscow, paralyzed by the threat of its own dissolution, sent deputations to beg for his return. Even held the cards. He demanded, and he received, the right to govern as he chose, without the interference of the ancient councils or the traditional bonds of law. He split his realm into two. The Zemshchina, the land of the land, remained under the traditional administration of the Boyar Duma, left to manage the business of the state, the taxes, and the defense of the borders, as they always had. But the oprichnina was something else entirely. It was his personal domain, carved out of the heart of the country, comprising the most prosperous and strategically vital districts of Muscovy. Within these borders, the Tsar was not a sovereign bound by custom or church. He was a master acting by his own decree. And to enforce that decree, he created the oprichniki. They were a hand-picked corps of 1,000 men, eventually growing to several times that number, sworn by a brutal oath of loyalty to the Tsar and to him alone. They were to be the new nobility of the terror state, untied from old family loyalties, answerable only to the man in the palace at Alexandrova Sloboda. To identify themselves and to terrify those who watched them pass, they allegedly adopted a distinctive set of emblems. According to the German adventurer Heinrich von Staden, who served in their ranks and later wrote to advise a foreign prince on how best to conquer Russia, the oprichniki rode black horses and carried at their saddles a dog's head and a broom. The meaning was as plain as it was grim: to sniff out the enemies of the Tsar and to sweep them from the earth. We must be careful here. Staden was a man with a motive. He wrote his account as a proposal for the invasion of his former master's country, desperate to find a new patron after fleeing Moscow. Alongside other hostile witnesses like Albert Schlichting and the duo of Taub and Cruz, he had every reason to paint the oprichnina in the most vivid, grotesque, and damning colors imaginable. Their testimonies, while invaluable, are the reports of men who had seen their own positions collapse, or who stood to gain from the degradation of the Russian state. They described a court at Alexandrova Sloboda that functioned like a dark inversion of a monastery, with Ivan acting as its abbot, while his inner circle engaged in orgies of piety and violence. We see the image through their eyes, and their eyes were filled with the bitterness of the excluded and the malice of the exile. Yet even after peeling back the layer of foreign polemic, the fact of the oprichnina remains. It was a systematic effort to break the power of the old boyar clans. Over the years that followed, thousands of families were forcibly uprooted from their ancestral lands. Their estates were confiscated and handed to the oprichniki, who lacked any connection to the soil they were given. The social fabric of the Russian interior was effectively shredded. Men whose families had served the Grand Princes for generations found themselves exiled to the periphery, their titles stripped, their wealth seized, and their lives held in a permanent, precarious balance. The terror was not merely a matter of land, it was a matter of reach. In the early years, the lists of the condemned were drawn up, and the executions followed. These were not the chaotic uprisings of a mob, they were bureaucratic acts of state. The Tsar's victims were often men of high standing, charged with treason against the oprichnina, or with secret sympathy for the zemshchina. The memorial lists, or synodiki, which Ivan himself compiled and sent to monasteries to pray for the souls of the dead, provide a somber ledger of the toll. While modern estimates of the scale of the killing vary widely, the lists confirm that the state was systematically purging its own elite. To the common people, the oprichnina often felt like a storm that had decided to stay. The dual administration created a nightmare of competing jurisdictions. A man might be subject to the law of the zemshchina one day and find his property seized by an oprichnik the next. Yet for all the upheaval, the Tsar remained a figure of distant, divine authority. The propaganda of the time, bolstered by the Orthodox Church, framed the Tsar's actions as a necessary, if agonizing, purification of a corrupt realm. It was a theme Ivan would return to in his correspondence, that he was a shepherd, forced to cull the wolves from his flock, even if it meant staining his own hands in the process. The foreign observers, however, were not looking for religious metaphor. They were looking for evidence of madness. Schlichting, who had been a prisoner and had every reason to despise his captors, filled his pages with accounts of the Tsar's volatile moods and the casual cruelty of his enforcers. Taub and Cruz, who had served as the Tsar's agents in Livonia before defecting, portrayed the oprichnina as a descent into pure, unreasoning chaos. We read their accounts today, and we see the foundations of the legend, the image of the Tsar as a man driven not by statecraft, but by a fevered, internal malice. We see the origins of the terrible that would be passed down to the modern world. But the oprichnina was not, at least in its design, a mechanism for chaos. It was a mechanism for control. By creating a separate state, Ivan had rendered the old boyar class obsolete, replacing them with a new, dependent order that had no power, save what the Tsar chose to grant them. He had destroyed the checks on his own authority by simply walking away from them and building a new structure from the ashes. It was a feat of political engineering that would have been the envy of any contemporary monarch had it not been carried out with such a disregard for the survival of his own administrative class. As the years passed, the line between the oprichnina and the zemshchina began to blur, but the terror did not diminish. It became a permanent feature of life in the heart of the realm. The constant turnover of the elite, the fear of the black-clad riders, and the uncertainty of the law created a climate where caution was the only currency. The boyars who remained were those who had learned to be silent, or those who had proven their loyalty by participating in the very purges that dismantled their own class. Russia now had two halves, one the ordinary land of ordinary men, the other the private hunting ground of a Tsar who answered to no one, patrolled by riders in black with a dog skull and a broom at the saddle. For a time the terror fell on individuals, a boyar here, a family there, an estate seized, a name struck out. But a machine built to find treason will always find more of it. In the winter of 1570 it would be turned loose not on a man or a family, but on an entire city. In the winter of the oprichnina, the terror did not merely hunt in the shadows, it began to demand a public audience. The line between the state's protection and the sovereign's caprice had vanished, and the first to test the depth of that void was the head of the Russian Church himself, Metropolitan Philip. A man of quiet, iron-willed integrity, Philip had once been a friend of the Tsar, but as the black-clad riders of the oprichnina tightened their grip, his conscience gave way to an open, public condemnation. From the pulpit of the Dormition Cathedral, he dared to tell the Tsar that while he was a sovereign of the earth, he remained a servant of the Almighty, and that the blood he spilled would cry out from the soil. Ivan did not strike him down in the sanctuary. Instead, he stripped him of his office, subjected him to a rigged trial of compliant clergy, and sent him into a long, cold confinement. In the December of 1569, as the Tsar's forces moved toward the west, the Metropolitan was found dead in his cell. The traditional accounts of the time, including the testimony of those who would later write for foreign eyes, named Malyuta Skuratov, the most feared of all, the Tsar's inner circle, as the man who entered that room and ended the life of the priest. Whether he was strangled by Skuratov's hands or died of the neglect of his captors, we cannot know with finality. The record is clouded by the narratives of those who wished to paint the Tsar in the darkest possible ink. But his death was the final clearing of the stage. There were no voices left in the Kremlin that dared to ask the Tsar why. The silence that followed was broken by the thunder of the march on Novgorod. By early 1570, the Tsar had become convinced, or at least persuaded by his own inner security, that the great northern city, the ancient, wealthy, and independent-minded heart of trade, was planning to defect to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a suspicion that turned into a crusade. The oprichnina army, a force of thousands, moved with a terrifying systematic purpose. They did not just march, they built a wall of steel around the city, blockading it, and then, under the personal supervision of the Tsar, they began the task of purifying the population. For weeks the city was subjected to a systematic ransacking. Shops were looted, churches were stripped of their icons, and the citizens were gathered and interrogated in the face of death. The accounts provided by foreign witnesses, such as Albert Schlichting, who were present in the Tsar's camp, are vivid, grotesque, and deeply coloured by their own position as captives or observers in a hostile land. They spoke of people tied to sleds and dragged to the river, of mass drownings in the freezing currents of the Volkhov, and of a deliberate, calculated campaign to break the spirit of the city forever. We are left to grapple with the toll of that winter, and the numbers are a battlefield in their own right. The early chronicles, penned in the heat of a traumatized age, reached for the apocalyptic, claiming as many as 60,000 dead, a figure that would have essentially emptied the city of its living soul. Modern historians, however, have performed the grim labour of the accountant by cross-referencing the memorial lists, the synodiki, which the Tsar himself had sent to monasteries to pray for the souls of his victims. Scholars like Ruslan Skrinikov have arrived at a far more sober, if no less haunting, conclusion. These lists, along with the internal reports of the oprichnina's own administration, suggest a death toll closer to 2,000 or 3,000. Other researchers, accounting for the wider destruction and the indirect loss of life, push that range upward toward 15,000. The exact figure is likely lost to time, buried beneath the ice and the rhetoric of those who survived to write the history. What is beyond dispute is that Novgorod, the great merchant republic of the north, was shattered. Its independence was extinguished, its wealth was hauled away to Moscow, and its status as a rival center of gravity to the Tsar's capital was ended. The terror had achieved its political goal, but it had done so by carving a wound into the heart of the Russian state that would fester for generations. The poison of that winter soon flowed back into the capital. Having decimated the alleged traitors of Novgorod, the machine began to turn its gaze inward toward the very men who had operated the levers of the terror. In the summer of 1570, the Red Square in Moscow became the theatre for a series of public executions that shocked even those accustomed to the Tsar's shifting moods. High-ranking officials of the oprichnina itself, men who had been the architects of the recent purges, were suddenly accused of treason and dragged to the block. Malyuta Skuratov and his cohorts, once the untouchable enforcers of the Tsar's will, were now the ones orchestrating the deaths of their own colleagues. It was as if the logic of the terror had reached its inevitable conclusion once the definition of treason was expanded to include anyone who might possibly be disloyal. No one, not even the most faithful servant, could ever be truly safe. The foreigners in Moscow, those like the agent Jerome Horsey or the various merchants of the Muscovy Company, watched with a mixture of horror and fascination, sending reports back to their masters in England and Europe that painted a portrait of a court in the grip of a fever. They saw a sovereign who moved between bouts of intense, agonizing piety and spasms of cold-blooded violence, a man who seemed to be systematically dismantling the very structures of power he had spent his life building. This was the Grozny quality the sources described, not the cruelty of a man who enjoyed pain, but the unpredictable, storm-like force of a ruler who felt he was surrounded by a world of shifting, hidden enemies. Every execution was framed as a necessity, every purge justified by the discovery of another plot. Yet, in the eyes of those who watched, the Tsar was becoming a prisoner of his own paranoia. He lived behind the walls of his fortified residences, surrounded by a brotherhood of men bound to him by blood and the shared guilt of their actions. The state was no longer a single, unified organism. It was a fractured house, divided into the Zemshchina, where the old order still nominally survived, and the oprichnina, the Tsar's private domain, where he was the sole, unchecked law. This dual administration, designed to bypass the traditional boyar influence, had instead created a vacuum where only force mattered. The terror had turned the entire realm into a site of constant, low-level war, and in that climate, the ordinary business of governance, taxation, defense, diplomacy, began to suffer. The administrative heart of Russia was slowing down, distracted by the constant need to identify, prosecute, and punish the phantom traitors that seemed to exist in every corner of the court. The reports that reached foreign ears were often laced with the biases of their authors, who were frequently men whose own interests were tied to the success or failure of specific factions within the Kremlin. They wrote to justify their presence, to warn their governments of the dangers of Muscovy, or simply to satisfy the hunger of a European public fascinated by the rumors of an exotic, despotic East. When they described the Tsar's outbursts, his long periods of fasting, or his sudden, violent shifts of temper, they were describing a man they could not comprehend. They saw the terrible king of their own worst anxieties, not the formidable ruler of a Russian tradition that demanded a Tsar be a force of nature. They lacked the context of a society that had been forged in the crucible of Mongol dominance and the constant existential threat of border wars. They judged the Tsar by the standards of a Renaissance Europe that was itself experiencing the brutal, sectarian conflicts of the Reformation. And yet, even after accounting for the bias of the foreign pen, the reality of the terror remained. The lives lost were not imaginary. The broken families were real. The fear that hung over the streets of Moscow was a tangible, heavy thing that silenced the markets and emptied the cathedrals. How many died at Novgorod? No one will ever truly know. The chronicles cried tens of thousands. The careful modern counts say some thousands. And the gap between those numbers is itself a kind of monument to how history is made. What is certain is that the second city of Russia never recovered, and that the machine had begun to devour the very men who built it. But terror cannot guard a border. And in the summer of 1571, the reckoning for all of it came riding up from the south, and this time it came with fire. A ruler who defines himself by the terror he inflicts eventually discovers that fear is a poor shield against the world. For years, the oprichnina had operated on the premise that the greatest danger to the state lay within its own borders, among the supposed traitors and hidden conspirators who walked the halls of the Kremlin or held the lands of the Zemshchina. Every resource of the state, every scrap of attention from the throne, and every ounce of its best military manpower had been diverted into the machinery of internal persecution. While the oprichniki rode across the countryside in their black uniforms, their brooms and severed dog heads tied to their saddles, the perimeter of the realm grew brittle. And in the spring of 1571, the bill for that preoccupation finally came due. Devlet Girai, the Khan of Crimea, had long observed the internal unravelling of Muscovy. He saw a land where the military command had been shattered by purges, where the border garrisons were undersupplied, and where the most experienced commanders had either been executed, exiled, or forced to look over their shoulders at their own king. In May of 1571, the Khan launched his strike. He did not merely raid, he bypassed the defensive lines that had been left neglected and drove straight for the heart of the realm. By the 24th of May, the Crimean army arrived at the outskirts of Moscow. What followed was a catastrophe that the official chronicles of the era struggled to describe in full. The city was almost entirely built of wood, and the Khan's forces set it ablaze. The fire was so intense and the wind so fierce that the entire city became a furnace. Thousands of people huddled in the streets or trapped in the stone buildings that could not protect them from the heat, perished in the inferno. The estimates of the dead vary wildly. Some sources cite tens of thousands, others suggest a lower, more localized count, but the reality was the total annihilation of the capital. The Kremlin itself was scorched, and the Tsar, who had fled the city as the invaders approached, found himself the sovereign of a kingdom that could not even shield its own heart. The Khan carried off a staggering number of captives, leaving behind a smoking ruin that stood as a silent, charred indictment of the oprichnina. The very institution designed to protect the Tsar had failed to protect his throne. In the aftermath, the Tsar's position was shattered. The failure was too public, too absolute, to be blamed on the usual scapegoats. The oprichniki, who had spent their existence hunting imaginary enemies in the dark, had proven themselves entirely hollow when faced with a real one. The humiliation cut deeper than any defeat on the battlefield. It exposed the fundamental delusion of the last 6 years. Yet the state was not yet dead. If the oprichnina had failed the defense, the traditional military structures, which had been left to wither in the shadow of the terror, still held the latent capacity for resistance. In 1572, when Devletgire returned, emboldened by his success, he was met at the Battle of Molody by a unified Russian force. This time, the commanders were not those favored by the oprichnina, but the men who knew how to fight a conventional war against a nomadic foe. The victory at Molody was decisive, a crushing blow to the Khan that halted the threat from the south for a generation. It was a victory won not by the terror state but by the traditional military power that the Tsar had spent years trying to dismantle. The lesson was unavoidable. In the autumn of 1572, the Tsar issued the order. The oprichnina was abolished. He did not merely end it. He decreed that the very name was to be struck from the record, forbidden from speech, as if uttering the word were a crime against the state itself. The division of the land into the oprichnina and the zemshchina was erased. The black-clad riders who had been the terror of the realm were ordered to disperse, their lands returned, their influence dissolved. It was a silent admission of failure, though it did not bring peace to those who had suffered under the system. The selective, cold-blooded repression of the state continued, but the machinery of the oprichnina was gone. While the south was secured, the long, grinding tragedy of the Livonian War continued to consume the north. For 25 years, Ivan had sought to secure a window to the Baltic, to force Russia into the circle of European maritime powers and break the isolation that had defined the reign of his father and grandfather. The English, arriving via the White Sea, had provided a lifeline of trade, and the Tsar had repeatedly looked to Queen Elizabeth as a potential ally, even in his more desperate moments as a potential sanctuary. But the war had grown beyond his ability to sustain it. By the late 1570s, the tide had turned decisively against him. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, under the command of the formidable King Stephen Bathory, launched a series of brilliant, aggressive campaigns that carved through the Russian defences. Simultaneously, the Swedes pressed in from the north. The gains of the early years were stripped away, fortress by fortress, until the Russian presence in the Baltic was almost entirely extinguished. The treaties that followed, the Truce of Yam-Zapolsky in 1582 with Poland and Lithuania, and the Treaty of Plessa in 1583 with Sweden, marked a humiliating conclusion. Russia was pushed back from the sea, its western territories lost, its treasury bled dry by a quarter-century of conflict, and its population pushed to the brink of exhaustion. The Tsar, who had begun his reign with the capture of Kazan and the expansion of the borders, was now a man watching his life's work contract. The English door remained ajar. The Muscovy Company still brought its wool and its weapons to the northern ports, but the grand strategic vision of a maritime empire had collapsed into a bitter struggle for survival. He was isolated, his health failing, and the shadow of the succession began to loom over the Kremlin like a gathering storm. The terror state that had failed to defend its own capital was dissolved, and its name was struck from speech as if it had never been. The long war in the West was lost, the coastline gone, the treasury drained, the country exhausted, and yet the heaviest blow of Ivan's whole reign was still to come, heavier than Novgorod, heavier than the burning of Moscow. It would fall not on a city or an army, but inside a single room within his own family by his own hand, if the foreigners who reported it can be believed. The war in the West had curdled into a slow, grinding disaster, and the state, once so hungry for expansion, now labored under the weight of its own failures. At the center of this gathering gloom sat the Tsar, an aging man in his early 50s who had spent a lifetime in the saddle and a quarter-century in the shadow of his own terror. He was not the man he had been at the taking of Kazan. The fire of his early reforms, the intellectual vigor of his correspondence, the fierce, frantic piety of his middle years, all had been subsumed by a long, jagged decline. He had seen his capital incinerated by the Khan of Crimea, his oprichnina dissolved in a wash of its own blood, and his borders pushed back by the Swedish and Polish-Lithuanian forces that now pressed in from every direction. By the autumn of 1581, the tension in the royal residence at Alexandrova Sloboda had become absolute. It was there, in the middle of November, that the catastrophe occurred which would define the final descent of the dynasty. According to the chronicles of the time, or rather according to the accounts that travelled out of Russia and into the hands of its most committed adversaries, a quarrel erupted between the Tsar and his namesake, the Tsarevich, Ivan. The son was 27, a man of promise, educated, capable, and already tempered by the administrative burdens of his father's court. He had seen the terror rise and the state buckle. He had stood beside the Tsar through the worst of it. The details of their final confrontation are lost to the mists of centuries, yet the legend that solidified in the foreign mind is stark, a flash of uncontrollable rage, an iron-tipped staff raised in a moment of fury, a single, devastating blow. By the 19th of November 1581, the Tsarevich was dead. We must speak of this with extreme care. The story of the filicide is the anchor of the legend, yet it is a story delivered to us almost entirely by the pens of outsiders. Antonio Posavino, the Jesuit diplomat sent to negotiate a church union, was in Russia at the time. He reported the death as a tragedy of the Tsar's own making, a narrative that suited the interests of a Catholic mission hoping to sway a grieving, vulnerable monarch. Heinrich von Staden, a former oprichnik who had fled the country and wrote specifically to incite foreign intervention against his former master, painted a picture of a madman consuming his own bloodline. These men had every reason to portray the Tsar as a monstrous figure, a man beyond the pale of civilization, whose very existence was a threat to his own kin. They were not disinterested observers, they were architects of a reputation. Yet there is a counter-narrative, one that has gained ground in some scholarly and orthodox circles in the centuries since. It suggests that the Tsarevich did not die of a father's blow, but of a lingering illness, or perhaps of something more insidious. When Soviet researchers opened the tombs in the Kremlin in 1963, they found the remains of the Tsarevich and the Tsar himself. The tests conducted on the son's bones revealed concentrations of mercury, arsenic, and lead that were, by any modern standard, extreme. It is a detail that echoes with a haunting familiarity across the history of the Rurik dynasty. Was he poisoned, as some have argued, perhaps by the same court factions that had shadowed his father's life for decades? The skull was too fractured by time and the conditions of the crypt to offer a definitive answer regarding a trauma caused by a staff. The mercury, as ever, remains ambiguous. Medicine, cosmetic, or toxin, it is a signature that the graves of the 16th century refused to clarify. The world, however, did not wait for the evidence of the bones. It seized upon the image of the tragedy, and it gave that image a face 300 years later. In 1885, the painter Ilya Repin unveiled his monumental canvas, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan. It is an image that has since become the definitive visual shorthand for the reign of the first Tsar. In it, the father holds his son in a desperate, frantic embrace, eyes wide with horror as blood pools on the carpet. It is a masterpiece of emotion, a work of profound psychological weight, but it is not evidence. It is a 19th century artist's interpretation of a 16th century rumour, a painting that serves as a mirror for the viewer's own fears rather than a window into the past. We look at Repin's canvas and we see a monster, but we must remember that we are looking at the imagination of a painter who lived in a different world, centuries removed from the dust and the politics of Alexandrova Sloboda. Whatever the truth of the final moments in that chamber, the geopolitical reality was singular and devastating. The Tsarevich Ivan had been the Tsar's only viable successor. He was the one who understood the machinery of the state, who had been groomed for the crown, and who possessed the authority to hold the fractious boyars in check. With his passing, the succession was cast into chaos. There remained only Feodor, a young man of deep, almost monkish piety, whose health was fragile and whose interest in the levers of power was non-existent. And far away, in the shadow of the nursery, there was the infant Dmitri, the child of a later contested marriage. The stability of the realm had relied on the existence of a strong hand to follow the Tsar's own. That hope had vanished in an instant. The death of the Tsarevich was the final, irreversible fracturing of the Rurikid line. It left the Tsar a shattered man, withdrawing from the business of the state, his health failing, his mind reportedly clouded by grief, and the persistent, nagging suspicion of enemies in every corner of his court. He began to donate vast sums to monasteries, seeking redemption for sins that he may or may not have committed, and his name was inscribed on the synodiki, the memorial lists of the dead, as if he were already a ghost. The terror had been his instrument, but it had also been his cage, and now, with the heir gone, the cage was all that remained. What truly happened in that chamber, no living witness recorded, and no grave has since confirmed. Only the enemies of Russia wrote it down, and the bones, when they were finally raised, answered in a language no one could read for certain. But whether by a father's blow or by some slower poison, the fact was the same, and it could not be undone. The heir who might have held Russia together was dead. The throne would pass to a son who could not rule it, and the man who had made himself the most formidable sovereign in Russian history had less than 3 years left to live. The years that followed the death of the Tsarevich were not the twilight of a reign, but the long, slow collapse of a world. By the early 1580s, the man who had once been the iron-willed reformer of Muscovy had been replaced by a prematurely aged, broken figure whose movements were as erratic as his moods. The court of the Kremlin, once a place of calculated policy, had curdled into an atmosphere of suffocating suspicion, recorded for the outside world by a new generation of foreign observers. Among them was the English merchant Jerome Horsey, whose accounts of the final days are as vivid as they are self-interested. Horsey, a man maneuvering through the labyrinth of the Muscovy Company's interests, described a Tsar who looked like a man possessed by his own shadows, a ruler who spent his nights in the company of astrologers and soothsayers, trying to read his own end in the stars. It was in this desperate, late-stage orbit that the Tsar turned again toward the English door he had first opened decades earlier. In a series of curious, often contradictory negotiations, even sought a matrimonial alliance with the court of Elizabeth I, setting his sights on the Queen's kinswoman, Mary Hastings. Whether he truly intended to marry her or whether he was merely building an escape hatch for himself remains one of the great unsettled questions of his final years. Some accounts suggest that the Tsar was preparing a refuge in England, a place to flee if his own boyars finally rose to tear him down, while others dismiss the overtures as the fever dreams of a dying man grasping for a legitimacy that was already slipping through his fingers. We cannot know his mind. We can only look at the letters that crossed the sea and the reports of the envoys who carried them, and wonder if a man who had burned so much of his own country was truly searching for a way out. His domestic life had become a fractured mirror of his reign. After the death of Anastasia, the number of women who held the title of Tsaritsa remains a subject of intense historical disagreement. Tradition often lists 6, though some sources tallying the irregularities of the Church have pushed that number as high as 8. Only the first 4 marriages carried the clear, undisputed sanction of the Orthodox Church. The rest blurred the lines of canon law and social custom, leaving a trail of questions that would eventually feed the instability of the succession. His final wife, Maria Nagaya, bore him a son, the infant Dmitri, but the boy was a child of a disputed union, and he offered no security to a throne already tilting into an abyss. By the early spring of 1584, the end was closing in. On the 18th of March, the Tsar was in his chambers, reportedly occupied with a game of chess. According to the accounts handed down by those present, accounts that carry the weight of the moment but remain filtered through the perspectives of men who had every reason to colour the truth. He began to prepare his pieces, standing at the board, when he suddenly collapsed. The cause of that final failure has been debated ever since. To some, it was the inevitable conclusion of a life lived in a state of perpetual, high-strung exhaustion, a stroke or a heart simply overwhelmed by the weight of a reign that had turned into a prolonged, self-inflicted siege. To others, it was the final act of a long-standing conspiracy, the work of the very men who had surrounded him, using the one instrument that left no mark: poison. The question of the poison was not settled by his death. It only moved from the court to the grave. When, in 1963, the sarcophagi of the Rurikid dynasty were opened for scientific examination, the remains of the Tsar were tested for heavy metals. The findings were stark and they were unsettling, elevated levels of mercury and arsenic, far beyond what would be expected even in a body of that era. Yet, as with the deaths of his mother and his wife, the science offers no finality. Mercury was a staple of the physicians of the time, used to treat the very ailments that plagued the aging Tsar, and the presence of these elements is as easily explained by the medicine of the day as by a murderer's cup. The evidence is suggestive, but it remains a ghost of a proof, a signature written in the dust of the tomb that refuses to speak its full meaning. His death left the throne to his son Feodor, a man remembered by the chronicles as physically frail and temperamentally unsuited to the demands of a realm that required a firm, if not a ruthless, hand. With the death of the Tsar, the real center of gravity shifted immediately to the Boyar councils, and specifically to Boris Godunov, a man who had risen through the chaos of the oprichnina to become the true architect of the state. It was a vacuum of power that the Rurikid dynasty could not survive. Within 14 years, Feodor would follow his father into the tomb, dying without a direct heir. The ancient line of the Rurikids, which had traced its origins back to the very dawn of the Russian state, would reach its silent end. What followed was the time of troubles, a period of civil war, famine, foreign invasion, and social disintegration that would nearly erase the concept of a Russian state entirely. It was the long, devastating consequence of the broken succession and the internal terror that had hollowed out the nobility and the administration. The man who had sought to make Russia fearsome had, in the end, left it fragile, and the edifice he had built to protect his power would become the very instrument of its undoing. The board was set, the pieces standing, the game never begun, and the most formidable sovereign Russia had yet produced simply fell and was gone. When his tomb was opened, nearly 4 centuries on, his bones carried the same faint signature of mercury that shadowed his mother, his wife, and his son. Poison, or medicine, or nothing at all. The grave keeps its secret still. He left a throne to a son who could not hold it, and a country that would soon tear itself apart. But the strangest thing about Ivan Grozny was not how he lived or how he died. It was the single word the world would remember him by, and how completely that word would come to lie. It is the final, heavy irony of his life that he is known to the world by a word that only half exists. We call him the Terrible, and we mean a man of bottomless cruelty, a man who broke the natural order of affection and governance to satisfy a dark, interior hunger for blood. We mean a monster, but the name he carried through his own life, the name that has echoed through every Russian account for 400 years, is Grozny. It is not a synonym for evil, nor for a defective character, nor for the madness that later writers would so eagerly attribute to him. It is a word drawn from the lexicon of nature. It comes from groza, the Russian word for a thunderstorm. To be Grozny was to be fearsome. It was to be formidable. It was the quality of the sky when the light begins to fail and the air grows heavy with the coming strike. It was the awe that an absolute sovereign inspired in a world that recognized only the authority of God above him. When the first English merchants and diplomats arrived in the port of Arkhangelsk or journeyed to the Kremlin, they encountered this word and reached for their own dictionaries. They chose terrible because in the 16th and 17th centuries, the English word still held that older classical weight. It meant something that inspired terror, a thing of immense and dangerous power. The translation was not a mistake of language, but a bridge between 2 different ways of viewing a king. Yet, as the centuries turned, the English language drifted. Terrible lost its stature and became a common epithet for anything disagreeable, anything small, anything poorly done. It fell from the sky to the gutter. The Russian Grozny remained, as it had always been, a title of dread-inspiring majesty. We lost the majesty and kept only the monster. This distortion was not an accident of time alone, it was a project of history. The figure we recognize today, the wild-eyed man clutching the staff, the butcher of his own kin, was assembled in the inkwells of foreigners. Almost every lurid detail that has become synonymous with his name, every grotesque account of the oprichnina's reach, comes to us through the foreign pen. We rely on Sigismund von Herberstein, the diplomat who shaped the European view of a primitive despotic Muscovy, on the German mercenary Heinrich von Staden, who wrote his accounts to entice foreign powers into an invasion of the very land he had served, on the accounts of Albert Schlichting, Taub, and Cruz, who wrote from the bitterness of defection or the malice of prisoners. We rely on the letters of Prince Andrzej Kurbski, written from the safety of the Polish-Lithuanian border. and on the journals of Jerome Horsey and Antonio Posivino, men who watched the court from the precarious vantage of the outsider. These men were not necessarily liars, but they were never impartial witnesses. They were men with agendas, men who needed to justify their own flight, to sell their own expertise to foreign courts, or to explain a Russia that felt alien and hostile to their own Western sensibilities. They reported what they saw, but they also reported what they feared, what they heard in the whispers of the taverns, and what they believed would best serve their readers back home. They gave us a Tsar who was a caricature of despotism, a man whose every act was a sign of a psyche unmoored from reality. And because it is easier to understand a cartoon of evil than the complexities of a sovereign caught between the demands of empire and the collapse of his own sanity, the legend took root. It was reinforced by the later painters of the 19th century who took these foreign anecdotes and gave them the weight of historical fact in their monumental canvases. When we look at a painting of Ivan, we are not looking at the man. We are looking at the 19th century's imagination of a 16th century monster. We see this same pattern of myth-making in the stone of Moscow, the legend of St. Basil's Cathedral, the story that Ivan blinded its architects so they could never build anything so beautiful again, is perhaps the most enduring stain on his reputation. It is a story designed to prove a point, that he was a man who hated beauty as much as he hated life. But the record is clear, and it is silent on any such brutality. The architects, Postnik and Barmer, continued their work for years after the cathedral was consecrated, leaving their mark on other structures across the realm. The stone stayed, and the records prove it. The myth outran the stone, and it persists because it is a perfect, terrifying shorthand for a man who is supposed to have had no heart. To strip away the myth is not to exonerate the man. It is a mistake to flip the coin and find a saint, just as it is a mistake to leave it showing only the monster. The truth is found in the friction between the two. The Novgorod massacres were real, and they were, by any accounting, a profound and horrific failure of statecraft that left thousands dead. The oprichnina, that state within a state, was a machine of profound social fracture that hollowed out the nobility and set the stage for the chaos that would follow his death. The death of his son and heir, the Tsarevich Ivan, remains a wound in the heart of Russian history, a moment of irreparable loss that left the throne to the incapable Fyodor and ensured the end of the Rurikid dynasty. Whether that death was the result of a sudden, fatal blow in a moment of rage or a tragedy of illness and accident, it was the pivot upon which the entire future of the Russian state turned. He was a man of his time, and his time was a crucible. He was the child who watched his parents die and his kingdom be torn apart by wolves in silk robes. He was the young king who looked at the maps of the world and saw that Russia had no window to the sea, no voice in the councils of Europe, and no law that could hold a fractious nobility in check. He built a code of laws. He brought the trade of the English ships to his northern shores, and he expanded his borders with the iron resolve of a man who believed he was an instrument of God. He was a reformer who died a tyrant, a man who believed so fiercely in the necessity of his own rule that he was willing to burn his own house down to save the throne. He was not a madness in the shape of a man. He was a man who lived through a lifetime of catastrophes. The death of his mother, the agonizing loss of his wife, Anastasia, the suspected treachery of his closest friends, the shifting loyalties of the boyars, and the constant, gnawing threat of betrayal. Each loss, each scandal, each perceived insult was a stone added to the weight he carried. If he became a man of terror, he did not do so in a vacuum. He did so in a world where he believed, with every fibre of his being, that the alternatives were submission or destruction. He was a creature of his own making, shaped by the same violence he eventually turned upon his people. We have spent centuries looking at him through the lens of a mistranslated epithet and a foreign bias. We have looked for the man in the paintings of the Romantics and the accounts of the spurned, and we have ignored the evidence of the state he left behind. He was a sovereign who claimed the title of Tsar and made the world accept it. He was a builder who raised cathedrals that define the skyline of Moscow. He was a destroyer who left behind a legacy of ash. He was the first of the autocrats and the last of the Rurikids, and he died with the knowledge that his life's work was likely to crumble as soon as his heart stopped beating. His life was a long, slow descent from the promise of the reformist years to the claustrophobic darkness of the final days at Alexandrova Sloboda. He lived in the shadow of his own myth even while he was still breathing, and he died leaving behind a country that was in many ways more fragile than the one he had inherited. The tragedy of Ivan is not that he was a monster. The tragedy is that he was a man who tried to be a storm and found that storms leave nothing behind but the wreckage of what they were meant to protect. He was the architect of his own legend, and he was its first and most enduring victim. In his own tongue, he was never the terrible. He was the thunderstorm, the awe that silences a room, the dread that keeps an empire whole and grinds a city to nothing, the power that must not be defied. 4 centuries of foreign pens made him a monster, and 4 centuries of a shifting language made the monster a cartoon, and both are lies of a kind, because the truth was worse and stranger than either. He was the first Tsar of Russia and its lawgiver, and the destroyer of Novgorod, and the maker of a terror state, and if his enemies told it true, the killer of his own son. He built a nation, and he broke it. Remember him, then, not by the word the world got wrong in both directions, but by the whole of what he was, formidable, tragic, and genuinely unforgettably terrifying. Ivan, called Grozny, the storm that Russia has never quite stopped hearing.